God morgen. God morgen alle sammen, og velkommen til vårt alternative Deloitte-hus mens vi bygger om Nordlys. Det er veldig mange som her, som har vært her før og sett på våre TMT Predictions, som vet at vi da raskt går over til engelsk. My name is Joachim Gullaksen. I'm a partner in our strategy and transactions practice, and I work mostly with technology, media, and telco companies, helping them with organizational and strategic opportunities. And we work a lot in technology, media, and telecom around the world. And we even have people like Paul Lee who can spend all of his time actually researching and analyzing what's going on in this very dynamic market space. So for the 10th year in a row, we have Paul in Norway to talk about our TMT predictions for 2025. So this is our research where we really look at what are the trends, how is monetization happening, how are the changes affecting consumers and businesses around the world when it comes to this industry. So Paul, thank you so much for being here with us again. And as normal, we challenge you with a little bit of snow, which you're not used to from London, but you made it. Thank you. And I think we will take some questions as we go. We have the room in Oslo, but we also have outside Oslo a webcast going on live, so we can get questions from you in the audience as we go on the QR code. But we also have a microphone, so if you have a question for Paul, please raise your hand and we can address it throughout the seminar. With that, Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here again in Oslo. And it's fantastic to see so many of you in the room, as well as to meet all the people who are also online. And as Joachim said, we're very happy to take questions. And what we've got also is, as well as the predictions that we have, we've also included some previews of the Scandinavian Digital Consumer Trends Research, which will be launching very soon. So we'll provide mostly a global view, but also will provide specific points of view on the local markets as well. So first of all, what I'd like to do is just show you what is covered in predictions for this year. Online, there are the full versions of all the predictions, so you're very welcome to read those after the event. And we will focus on specific predictions which are most relevant to this audience. So we have a lot of content looking at three themes. So we have generative AI, because this is a topic that most of our clients continue to ask us about. We also have content on the media market, including Gen AI within there. And also we are looking at the telecoms market. So it's all three of them. Now, one thing that we will do in this particular presentation is I will try and guide you to read between the lines on our official Deloitte predictions. So the way in which we go to market is we're a bit enthusiastic about some of the trends which are happening. And what I'll try and do is give you a bit more context about some of the trends which we see happening there. Welcome. So first of all, what I want to do, though, is just take you back to some of the predictions from 2024. So what I'm going to do is mark some of the homework from last year. And basically, I'm going to show you two predictions from last year that we got wrong, which is not a great way to start off a presentation, but I'll explain to you why this is important. So a macro theme always is, how is something going to make money? Because ultimately, everything has to monetize. And last year, we had two predictions around monetization of generative AI, which form a pair. And one of the predictions was looking at revenue generation. So our prediction on revenue generation was that by the fourth quarter of the year, we expected the run rate for sales of enterprise software would be up by $10 billion. So that's $10 billion run rate, not for the year, but the run rate in terms of what enterprises will be paying for incremental Gen AI capabilities. And the reason why we focus on enterprise is because we expected that consumers would not pay for Gen AI. We assumed it would all be enterprises because consumers have been trained to assume that apps, etc., would always be for free. Now, the actual outturn for that, we think, is wrong, based on all the publicly available information there. So the actual spend on Gen AI enterprise software was actually a lot lower than we predicted. So that's one thing. So that's the plus column in terms of income for the industry. Now, looking at costs, we also had a forecast on how much would be spent on semiconductors for Gen AI, and we have predicted $50 billion. So that contrasts with the 10. And for that, we think we're way too low in terms of the actual spend. So again, it comes back to my question, how does this monetize? So now, of course, every industry always has an investment phase. But the question to ask is, what is the trajectory towards turning cash positive? How do you get there? So that's the question I've got. Now, just to look at context, because context is really important. So I find time series data is very interesting. And this is a chart which I borrowed from another analyst, Benedict Evans, who produces a lot of charts. So he really enjoys collecting data and is very meticulous when he's collecting data. And this over here is looking at the spend on CapEx for the 4 largest tech companies. So all from annual reports. And you can see the number goes up all the time, particularly in 2024. So the other question that I would ask is, but the tech industry is growing and growing and growing. And what looks like a big number may actually be a small number. So how big is this relative to sales? So this is one chart here, which is from Microsoft, and you can see what's happening to CapEx overall. So that's overall CapEx, includes lots of data centers, and you can see that CapEx as a share of sales is getting close to 1/3. Now, if you think back to a couple of slides back, so we're talking about the fact that you've got companies which have been trying out generative AI versions of software. They're not paying for it as a discrete, standalone piece of software. So what happens next? So in the last week, there have been a couple of announcements. So this over here is from press reports from last week. And you can see on the left-hand side, you've got bundling happening. So if people aren't choosing, then what you can also do is you can just include it for everyone. And then on the right-hand side, you've got another example over here, which is for Google. So that's one part of the Gen AI story, is in terms of monetization and pricing. So that's one part over here. Now, what I find is interesting as a researcher is you've got a lot of change happening with Gen AI as a business model, and also you have a lot of change happening with Gen AI as a technology proposition. And the first prediction I want to take you through today is around what's called agentic AI. Now, agentic AI is, in some regards, it's a iteration of the text-based models that we had 2 years ago. So probably 2 years ago, a lot of you were probably trying out ChatGPT. And a very common thing that I would hear 2 years ago, or slightly less than 2 years ago, is someone would go, oh, I created a bedtime story for my child. And I put in the name of the child, and I said, oh, I want you to create a bedtime story with these elements over here. And they would get a bedtime story out after about 10 seconds. So that was a form of like text-based output, and they would read that story to their child later that day. It was almost always fathers who said this, never mothers. And it was the first time they'd spoken to their children for about 3 years. But you've got to experiment on somebody, and children are free to use. So that was ideal. But that was what made people excited about a couple of years ago. So what agentic AI is kind of an iteration to this. So if you think text in, text out is quite basic, right? And then you can also have images out as well. But agentic, so what the promise of that is, and I'll stress promise, is the ability for AI, or generative AI, to think or reason like a human would do and use multiple sources of information to come out with an answer. So one example that's often talked about, for example, is if you have a call center agent who needs to address a problem and pulls information off different databases and also existing information to come up with an answer. So you give the algorithm or the computer program agency, which is not a very common English word, so it probably doesn't translate very well. And by the way, I'm very aware that probably the only person in this room who can't speak Norwegian is me. So thank you very much for translating. I always feel very embarrassed about this, but being embarrassed is less effort than learning Norwegian. So anyway, so it's about giving autonomy to the algorithm. That's the ideal. And that's a very appealing ideal. And when you think about what is appealing, also consider that at CES, there were various different themes which were all about autonomy, which became very sort of high profile. There was agentic AI, humanoid robots, and also self-driving cars, all of which are not making money, but which are very appealing because there is a deep human excitement and worry about being replaced. And this is partly what this is expressing. Now, I'm going to give you a lesson in how to read a Deloitte prediction and read between the lines. So what the prediction is that autonomous generative AI has a potential, right? So it's a potential. So this is not a reality right now. It's an intent. It has a potential to do that. The second thing, what is the actual numerical prediction? It's that 25% of companies that use Gen AI will launch agentic AI pilots. So the thing to note in there is it's not 25% of all companies, it's companies that are using Gen AI. Using Gen AI, what is that? Is that using it in commercial operations or as a pilot? So that's the other thing. So using Gen AI is a vague term in general, and then we'll do pilots or proof of concept. So a pilot may cost 100,000 kroner. So is it significant if you're just doing a pilot? And a pilot describes, it could be an offsite where you get various people to try out something, and then nothing else happens after that. Now, when I looked at some of the headlines in terms of the reporting on this prediction, the headlines refer to 25%. They do not qualify the prediction and put of companies that use Gen AI. So my ask of all of you is, if you read a headline, always continue to the next paragraph and often to the last paragraph, because that's where you get the actual detail of what's happening, is in the very last paragraph within there. So that's what, at a high level, agentic AI is about and what could happen. But I would stress it's about what could happen. Now, I expect agentic AI will come up a lot in the news in Q1 of this year. and most tech companies will talk about agentic AI. So you will hear the term a lot. And when you hear it, I would always ask, what do you mean by agentic AI? And which companies are using it outside of a pilot? So that's the question that I would ask. Now, just to give a bit more explanation on what agentic AI is. So in terms of the evolution, because it's quite complex. So what you've got with agentic AI is very different technologies working together. So a large language model is like ChatGPT. So it's where you use lots of language to generate more language. So it's text to text. And then also what you've got is multimodal, where you can have an image as an input to create text as an output. So that's one other thing that you can have there. Or you can have a video as an input and a video as an output. But what that also means, if you think about, let's say, an insurance claim and an image of a damaged car being one of the inputs, you can have text as an output. So multimodal is also there. And then autonomy is where you've got different bits of code working together to come out with an output. So that's another way of looking at the evolution of what's happening. And then this over here is from our Tech Trends report, which I think is launching in Scandinavia shortly. And again, this refers to some of the terms which are going to be out there. So a small language model is something which lots of corporates have done, which is where they have trained their own data sets, but using a third-party model for that. So like Gemini, or it could be ChatGPT. GPT-4 is very common. And then multimodal, and you've got agentic. So these are three terms which you'll hear a lot over the course of this year. So that's at the software level. Now, the next thing I want to look at is what's happening at the hardware level. So, and one of the questions that you'll have to consider over the course of this year, so a lot of laptops tend to get replaced every 3 years in a workplace. And then smartphones are moving to every 4 years. Now, the question is, do you need to have what's often called an AI PC or an AI smartphone? And when I hear discussions of AI smartphones, I think, what does that mean? Because smartphones, right from the start, have always relied on AI for things like power control. So when you turn the phone on its face down, it turns off the screen to reduce power. So that's a very simple calculation. So screen down, turn screen off to conserve power. And some of you, for example, if you've got an Apple Watch and an iPhone, when you get close to the phone will turn on. Or if you've got an Apple Watch and an Apple laptop, then your phone can also unlock your laptop. So these are all forms of AI. So AI is nothing new at all. The Gen AI part is brand new. Now the prediction being made here is that Gen AI will potentially increase sales of smartphones and also laptops. Now, I do think in 2025, both of those sales are going to go up. But I think it will be other factors which drive that. So this year, Microsoft is stopping support for Windows 10. So that's going to cause upgrades to computers which can support Windows 11, and also cause upgrades to other operating systems, such as Mac OS. So there will be a likely rise in the sale of PCs relative to the cycle. But will it be coincidence that some of these will be badged as Gen AI PCs, or will it be causation? So I think it will be coincidence. Now, if we look at smartphones, so what happened in 2021 was it was a year of heightened smartphone sales. And this was post-COVID supply chain challenges. So there was a spurt, there were deferred sales which are happening in 2021. Now, what's happening with smartphones is we used to change them every 2 years, then it went to every 3 years, now it's moving to every 4 years. And generally what happens is after a few years, smartphone batteries will naturally become a lot smaller. So it's just a chemical process. That is a point at which consumers have two options. One of them is to say, I will just change my battery because the contraction of batteries is a chemical process. So the logical step I'll do is to spend about 100 euros and replace the battery, or I could do it for even cheaper. But the emotional response is to say, I deserve a brand new phone because the phone is an expression of my character, and I need to have a phone with 3 lenses on the back rather than 2 to feel special. So you will all know how many lenses you have in your phone, and you'll be thinking, that person over there has got 3 lenses, I want that. So you'll go, because my battery is running out of capacity, I deserve a brand new phone. You're not probably going to be saying, I want to be able to create GenAI images, so I need a new phone. Now, there was a spurt in 2024, and there's also going to be a growth in sales in 2025. But the question to ask is this due to people wanting to run GenAI applications on their phones? And in Europe, 3% of people use GenAI daily. It's only 3%. So you contrast that to search or email or social media. It's very, very low. So it's not likely to be a driver of sales. But what is likely is old-fashioned envy, which can be rational because your battery is running out. Okay, so one thing to bear in mind, though, is what does GenAI capabilities get you? And the question I'd also be asking is, what is happening to truth? So there is an old maxim, which is that a photograph never lies. And now if you take a smartphone photograph, generally a smartphone photograph is never a single image, it's a composite of multiple images. And also it will adjust in tone. So nearby here, you've got a very famous art museum. If you take a photograph of any of the exhibits there, what is likely is the image that your smartphone captures will be different to what you can see in front of you. It will be brighter, it will be richer in tone, because the phone has learnt that that's what you like with your photographs. Now, talking about photography, so this over here is a photograph taken with a 2024 smartphone, and the image on the right has been adjusted. And so it's a faked image designed to change the context of the photograph. So the photograph on the right-hand side has had drug paraphernalia and sort of an empty wine bottle added to it to change the context of the photo. Now, what we could call this is a photoshopped or faked image, but the common term is Photoshop, which is what Adobe's not happy about, but that's a term that's ended up with. Now, the thing about photoshopping is that that's been possible for decades, but if you go back decades, photoshopping an image required skill, expensive software, and expensive hardware. And over time, the marginal cost of creating a faked image has gone down. So if you think of, if you've got kids with a smartphone, one of the first things they do is they do face swapping photographs. But they're quite obvious, and they're designed to be obvious and a bit silly. But this over here is malicious. So this is designed to change the nature of a photograph. Now, the other thing is, so if you look at the white powder down there, with this screen you can see it's integrated into the fabric of the rug. Now, I've got colleagues who tend to be really good at spotting fake photographs. It's one of their superpowers, as well as giving tax advice or audit. So it's that kind of person, not a consulting person. And they just go, right, they zoom in, they look at shadow, and so they look at that and they go, I cannot tell the difference. Now, the way in which that was added was a text-based prompt. So no use of zooming in and sort of like a lot of time. This was text-based prompts and a few seconds. And so the marginal cost of creating realistic malware, which this effectively is very, very low. So this is one thing to consider about that. Now, there are technology solutions for dealing with this problem. It's possible to have an obligatory store of all the images which sort of have been created. So you can have a an undeletable file which captures all the changes which are made, and you can press a button and go back to the original. All of that is possible, but it needs to be obliged. So that's one thing to consider. Now, the last thing on Gen AI, which I'll mention within this section, actually there's two more things, is around usage of Gen AI by gender. Generally with technologies, what we find is claimed adoption is higher amongst men, young men. Perhaps not in Norway, because you're very forward-thinking, but in other countries, that's what tends to happen. Now, in the US market, so this was written by some US colleagues, which is why it's just got US data, even though it's a global prediction. So what they're predicting is that the gender gap in terms of usage of Gen AI is going to narrow out. So their forecast methodology is in 23 to 24, growth in usage and awareness was a lot higher amongst women than men. So if that continues, you get to parity, which is quite a simplistic methodology, probably wrong. So, but what's interesting there is that you've got faster growth in usage awareness amongst women. Now, I want to contrast that with some other data we've got. So this is for the UK, and you can see awareness and usage of generative AI goes up for women and men, but the difference between awareness and usage remains about the same. So what happens in the US may not be happening in other markets. So that's just one thing to consider there. And the other thing which we find quite interesting is when you look at some of the statements around Gen AI, so agreement that Gen AI responses are unbiased, which can't be the case. So amongst men, the view that Gen AI responses are unbiased is a lot higher than for women. So that's one of the variation that you get by gender. So also what we see is awareness that Gen AI hallucinates is a lot lower amongst men than women. But if you think about who uses Gen AI right now, it tends to be young men in the workplace who don't realize that Gen AI is biased or that it hallucinates. So in your companies, are there any people that are using shadow IT, Gen AI, to save time, to look more productive, who don't understand where it goes wrong, its fallibility? Does that happen at all? Now, the last thing I'll look at is around Gen AI and Hollywood. And you know, I think there'll always be debates about Gen AI and creation and the extent to which technology is cheating. Now, the thing with Gen AI, I think, is, you know, so for AI to, for example, recreate voices, I think it works quite well. The problem with using Gen AI is it's not, for video, very realistic right now. So if you want to go for an unrealistic look, it's great. Otherwise, it's not that fantastic. But what we're predicting is that Gen AI is not going to be used very much by major studios this year. So we'll see what happens. Now, the next thing I want to do is just show you some examples of just how good Gen AI can be for some applications. And the application I want to show you is for translation. So that's what I want to show you, is Gen AI being used for translation. Now, the example I'm going to give is of one of my colleagues. So last week, we had the equivalent event for this, so the practice run for this session in London. And normally I co-present with a colleague, but he's on paternity leave, so he couldn't make it. So he recorded a video, and I'll show you the video now. So.
Hey everybody, I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person today. I'm at home looking after my daughter Poppy, who is here and is 5 weeks old. So hopefully Paul's doing a good job in my absence.
So that's Ben with his daughter Poppy, and at Deloitte we start people working at 5 weeks old. We are an equal opportunities employer, as you can tell, and we don't have to pay Poppy, so it's great. So this is another version.
Salut tout le monde, je suis vraiment désolé de ne pas pouvoir être avec vous en personne aujourd'hui. Je suis à la maison en train de m'occuper de ma fille Poppy, qui est ici, et à 5 semaines, donc j'espère que Paul fait du bon travail en mon absence.
Does anybody in the room speak French? How was that?
It sounded a bit automated.
A little bit automated. Okay, any other views? So, a bit automated? The math wasn't matched up. Right, so as a novelty, it works, but is it professional grade? And it's not professional grade. I mean, that's the point I want to make. So it's good enough for some applications, which will always be the case, but not for others. Does anybody here speak Italian? Okay, so this is one more version.
Ciao a tutti, mi dispiace davvero di non poter essere con voi di persona oggi. Sono a casa a prendermi cura di mia figlia Poppy, che è qui e ha 5 settimane, quindi spero che Paul stia facendo un buon lavoro in mia assenza.
Okay, Italian person, what do you think?
Pretty decent.
Pretty decent,
Yeah.
okay.
The sync is still off.
Yes. Now, the thing with the sync is, if this is a really good screen. If it was a mediocre screen, you wouldn't notice the sync was off. So that's the other thing. And again, it comes down to Hollywood level, you've got big screens. You can't get away with this. But on a website, you definitely can. And on TV sets, I think you probably could do. So that's the other thing, is generative AI works well for certain applications. Does anybody speak Mandarin? Okay, right. So no one speaks Mandarin. So I'll just go, this is perfect over here. None of you brought to tell.
很抱歉，今天不能亲自和你们在一起。我在家照顾我的女儿波比，她在这里，已经5周大了，所以希望保罗在我缺席期间能做得很好。
So that's a Chinese version. I don't speak Chinese. I've got no idea whether that works. But I've got some colleagues who've done the same, used the same tool on a phone and fooled relatives who are Mandarin speakers on a smartphone. It's very effective. Now I'm going to show you one more video. Do you have Coca-Cola in Norway? You've heard of that, right. So what I'm going to do is, well, actually I don't know cultural differences. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a Christmas video from Coca-Cola. And what I want to ask you is, what do you think of this? So Coca-Cola Real Magic is a strapline. Other soft drinks are available. I'll just add because we're being recorded and streamed. So I cannot prefer Coca-Cola or we'll get into trouble. What did you think of that? Did you notice anything about it? Okay, let me show it to you again. Now look at this. Okay, so if you consider people's faces, you rarely get symmetrical faces. So that's one thing. Secondly, if you imagine a family photograph, how often is everyone smiling and also has their eyes open? Right, so, sorry, I need to go back a bit. So have any of you seen a very old Coke ad, which is, I'd like to teach the world to sing? Do you remember that advert? So it was set on a hill, but basically you've got all these different people. Some of them have got their eyes closed, etc. But it was one of the most famous ads about 40 or 50 years ago. And in that one, you've got perfect symmetry. So that's all done using Gen AI. So one thing that will happen over the course of this year is you'll probably see more and more TV adverts with, for example, like cartoon animals. And cartoon animals are most likely to be Gen AI because humans generally can't tell when the images or the video of an animal is faked. But for a human, you can do, because that's what humans have been doing forever. So that's one thing which is going to come through. Now, on that note, I want to transition into talking about the media sector. And just to give you a couple of examples from the UK market. So one of the long-term trends is a move away from traditional broadcasters. Now in the UK, on Christmas Day is a big day for watching television, because it's a one day when families get together. And when families get together, if they start talking to each other, they end up arguing. So the way to avoid arguments is by watching television or for doom scrolling on your phones, or doing both at the same time. So on the left-hand side, you've got a sitcom called Gavin and Stacey, which is a rom-com. And that had 20 million viewers in the first 7 days. That's the equivalent of 100 million in the US market. So that's BBC One. And also on the same day, you had Wallace and Gromit, which is a cartoon, 16 million views. And again, a very high level of viewing. So the question is, or one of the points around this is, if you look at the UK market, which is about 1 or 2 years ahead of a lot of the rest of Europe, because you have lots of sort of English language content, is the broadcaster impact remains very high. So that's a point I'd want to make. Now, when we look at the subscription video on demand market in total, in the 2010s, the theme was a lot of growth in things like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and then in 2020 you had Disney Plus launching. In the 2020s, the theme has been of a plateau. So you've reached the limit of where you're likely to get to. So the subscription video on demand market, SVOD market, has several challenges. One of them is the proportion of people who are using it has reached a limit. The number of subscriptions that people have, which is this one over here, has also reached a limit. So you've got this really big challenge in terms of growth. Now, at the same time as that challenge, you've got the issue of churn. So churn is 20% in the UK market. It's about 40% in the US market, but you've got more providers. And the cost of acquiring a subscriber may be 100 euros. The subscription may be 100 euros. 20% churn is unaffordable. Now you may wonder, so what about the Scandinavian market? So this is from digital consumer trends for Scandinavia. And you've got 28% churn in this market. So how can you maintain very high churn levels? You've got a lack of growth in the number of people who are using it. And also there's a unwillingness to pay more. So what we think is going to happen is we're going to move to more indirect sales of subscription video on demand. So if you remember, the original idea behind video on demand services was going direct to consumer. And the idea was direct to consumer meant you kept all of the revenues. But the challenge with direct to consumer is you take responsibility for every subscriber. And in Europe, one other challenge around there is if you're looking to do things like an ad-funded tier, you've got to manage things like GDPR. And a lot of companies which for decades have been just creating content and selling it wholesale, culturally, they're not very excited about GDPR compliance. They're also not very excited about really good user interface demand. So that's the challenge which is out there. So when we look at the UK market, so this is a survey we did at the end of last year. So what we found was about a quarter of all subscriptions are already sold indirectly, and then 43% of respondents already have one indirect sale. So very commonly it's via pay TV, but with Apple TV Plus, the most common way of acquiring Apple TV Plus, which isn't direct, is actually via a bank account. So this is one way for the content providers to increase the number of subscriptions without having to take on the cost of subscribing. So this is a bit more detail here for Netflix in the UK. So you've got Sky, which is pay TV, and then you've got telcos being most of the rest of them. So I think there's a few people within telcos within the room, and the advantage of a telco reselling the content is with a SVOD subscription, often you have a monthly contract. With telco, it's 12, 18, 24 months. So we see more and more SVOD subscriptions being sold via telcos to address the problem of churn. So you remember for Scandinavia, churn is 28%. Now, one other chart I want to show you is this is what's happening with the amount of time spent watching video in UK households. Now, this is all measured. This isn't a survey. So in the UK, we've had measurement of consumption for, it's approaching 3 years and about 2.5 years publicly. Now, the red line is broadcaster content. So we're in an SVOD age, or so we think, and probably a lot of you watch a lot of video on demand. And if I did the same audience in London, very few people watch broadcaster content. But it's not a representative group of people. So this over here is naturally representative. It's probably the most accurate view you'll have of the UK. The blue line is TikTok and YouTube. And then the green line is SVOD and AVOD. And for SVOD and AVOD, almost all of that is Netflix, Disney, Amazon Prime. But we have 15 services. So how do the other 12 services monetize in the long term? How are they going to do it? Now, the other things which I think are really interesting is when you look at what's happening with Scandinavia. So look on the top right-hand side there. You look at, so one thing that you have in Europe is you have broadcaster streaming services, which you don't have in the US. And when I talk to our clients in the US, the idea of a public service broadcaster is just very unfamiliar to them. They find it very strange. They can't understand why you'd have that. But you can see amongst older age groups, you see how popular the streaming services are amongst the broadcasters. And that is without having a dedicated button to press for a linear channel to get to the live version of that. And one thing I would generally say amongst the public service broadcasters is I don't think generally they do streaming as well as they could do, because a lot of their audience likes the idea of a channel. It's simple. You don't have to think about what you want to watch. It's like having a menu of the day or a McDonald's offer, which is like you have the same thing wherever you go, or the Burger King offer is the same thing wherever you go. I checked it out yesterday in the station. It's the same thing. So people like homogeneity, predictability. So I think that number, those numbers there for the broadcasters could be yet higher. Now, when we think about the challenges for the streamers, so one of the other challenges for the streamers, and this is looking at the private streamers, is almost nobody makes money. Now, one way of trying to make money is by increasing price. And this is something that's been happening over the last 2 years. And if you read some of the financial reports of the streamers, what they say is, oh, we'll just raise price. So, and I think you can raise price once, you can raise price twice, but can you keep on raising price all the time? So this is some research we did on the US market where there's probably higher incomes, or there's definitely higher incomes. And this is the claimed reaction from people who are using streaming services. And you've got 50% of people across all age groups who are saying if the price goes up by $5, they will probably cancel. Now, it's stated intent rather than actual intent. But the thing is, when you look at inflation, so we got used to 10 years of almost no inflation. Now we've got inflation, and it's particularly high amongst groceries. And that really affects behavior. And it really affects behavior amongst the lowest 2 quintiles of consumers. And to try and understand what's happening in the US, this is a chart of grocery prices. And you may think, why does this matter? And it's because the price of, for example, orange juice, which is in the middle, is psychologically important. It's a staple. When you've got that kind of inflation, people think, I need to save money. And one of the quickest ways of saving money is subscription video on demand, because you've got a month-long subscription. So that's one of the things to consider. So that's the US market. And then this is the UK market, the price of cucumbers. And what I find amongst a lot of the management teams that I speak to in Europe in general is a lot of senior managers never go to cheap supermarkets like Lidl's or Aldi's. They don't see what is happening to the general consumer. They don't know the price of a cucumber, which is precisely why I have this chart in there. So when I'm going to see like the CFO of a broadcaster, I'll ask them, what's the price of a cucumber? And none of them ever know, because they delegate that to someone else. But I don't think you can understand your consumer unless you understand the price of a cucumber. It's 89 pence in the UK, by the way, at most of the supermarkets as well. Now, that's the media sector. And the last topic I want to have a look at is looking at the telecom sector. And one of the themes that we expect to see is around mobile telecoms consolidation. Now, we wrote this prediction before there was a merger that was allowed in the UK at the end of last year between Vodafone and Three. And what I expect is going to happen this year in Europe is probably going to see more 4 to 3 mergers happening. So in Denmark, you may see one. In Sweden, you may see one. Now, for a long time, the regulator in Europe, so the competition commissioner, would have blocked a 4 to 3 merger or applied penalties or conditions to make it very punitive. But the return on capital employed, so it comes down to monetization, is pretty challenging. So what we expect to see happening is probably more of these mergers being permitted. So you may see this in Denmark, you may see it in Sweden, you may see it in France, you may see it in Germany, and last year we saw it in Spain. So there's a shift there happening. So we're going from 2 strong operators and 2 weak operators in each market to probably 3 stronger operators. And then one of the trends which we may also see is a consolidation in the fixed market as well. And I just want to explain why I think this will happen. So this over here is pricing in the UK. So this is for fibre to the home and for the entry-level pricing. And the entry level is up to 1 gigabit per second, which you don't need. Now, the pricing here is between, say, 15 and 20 pounds or so. Now, the reason why that matters is the business cases for a lot of the fibre to the home companies was based on double the ARPU and about a 40 or 50% connection ratio. The actual connection rate, so homes passed, homes connected, is very low. So it's between 10 and 30%. And the ARPUs are going down. So the business case has become uninvestable. Now, the very last thing I'll look at is around fixed wireless access. So fixed wireless access is where you have the application of home broadband, but over a cellular network. So the benefit of this is partly that the cost of connection is very low. And as you move to 5G and standalone 5G, the capacity that you have just becomes a lot greater. So you can have mobility as an application and also home broadband as another. And then for the telecoms people in the room, so I'll just show you one last chart over here. So it used to be the case that people using mobile networks, the data usage per SIM was going up very, very fast. But it's really slowed down. So this is for the UK, but it's very similar in other markets, including Scandinavia. But the general trend, so the dotted line, is it's going down. So that just means that if you increase the capacity of a mobile network by 100%, the number of years before you use that capacity, rather than it being 3 years, it's going down to 5, 6, or 7 years. So it makes the viability of fixed wireless access a lot lower. So that's what I wanted to cover off. So we've covered off a lot of stuff on generative AI, on the challenges of the media market, and of structural shifts in the telecoms market. So next we're going to move to questions. And I'll end with, so this is a joke I found on the internet, but I changed it from saying go through all the pitch decks and replace crypto with AI, and I've changed it for AI to agentic AI, because that's what you're going to hear about a lot for Q1. Now, in terms of the questions, we can take questions in the room, and we have this roving mic so people who are online can hear. And also, you can submit questions here. If you want to submit a question in Norwegian, I now speak Norwegian via Joachim. So you don't have to submit a question in English. You can submit a question in any language: Norwegian, French, Italian, Mandarin, and English, using a translator. So over to you, Joachim.
Yeah, please raise your hands if you have questions. But we'll start off. I think one thing, and as you mentioned, we're doing the digital consumer survey for the Scandinavian market right now. And one of the findings that we see is the question you were on for streaming and pricing. We've seen reports from Disney and other players that actually in the US market, the AVOD, advertising video on demand, is attractive because you could then raise prices for the subscription, and if customers drop off, they can drop into the advertising video platform at a lower price point. And an interesting point you had, I think, which might not be as clear or obvious to us in Europe, is that the US has a very different advertising market. So I guess the question is, do you see advertising video on demand picking up a lot of the capacity in terms of subscription for streaming in Europe, as we're seeing in the move in the US?
Yeah, so I think advertising video on demand will grow very fast, but that's partly because the price of the ad-free tier will go up such a lot that you'll get a lot of consumers who will get bumped into the advertising-funded tier. Now, the next question is, how much revenue will be raised from advertising? And in the US market, it's relatively easy to charge a lot of money for each 1,000 views. So the CPM, which is a metric which is used. And if you think of something like the Super Bowl, which is the most expensive content, you may be able to charge something like $7 million per minute. But you can't get that anywhere else in the world. It's one event where you can get that. And for some of the pre-sales, I remember of, it's like one of the majors like Disney. I remember one year it was $9 billion. And that was almost double the entire value of the UK TV advertising market.
Nice.
And the UK TV advertising market is the most valuable in the UK. So they're completely different scales. And what I also find is, in the US market, a lot of the US majors, people who are based in LA or New York, they don't understand the concept of PSBs that you have in Europe and how strong they are, because they don't have them. And so having a strong public service broadcaster is a big, sort of like it's a big threat to the SVOD players. And that chart I was showing earlier, for the UK, you've got 60% broadcaster content, and that includes streamed content there, and only 16 to 17% for SVOD players. And we've had Netflix for coming up to 13 years in the UK. And it's not, you don't get like Gavin and Stacey type viewing. We're nowhere close to it.
Yep. And as we saw from the Scandinavian data, usage of the public broadcasters' player services is actually quite high across age groups, which is different to the regular streaming.
Yeah, it's because you've got strong brands. That's the thing. And I think we often dismiss old brands as being archaic, old-fashioned. But a lot of consumers, they rely a lot on old brands. They trust them. And that's one of the big challenges that we see, for example, in the UK market for some of the new streaming services is the new brands don't resonate, and you have to spend a lot of money to get your brand known.
Yep. I have another question here, unless there's something from the audience. Okay. Fixed wireless access, you touched on, which basically means, is it the end of digging, Paul? Will we have enough capacity in the homes through 4 and 5G networks to not have to have fixed lines coming into the houses?
So probably not overall. So where fixed wireless access works very well is where you've got 5G, and also where you've got often cities where you have people often in their first homes, rented homes, and not spending very much time at home. So if you need about 200 or 300 gigabytes per month, FWA can be quite good. Particularly if most of your usage is in the evening. So FWA is basically around using spare capacity up. So it is a solution, but it's not the entirety of the solution. And in Finland, which is one of the early adopters of FWA, what we're seeing is a move from FWA to FTTH. So where you've got clusters where there's a lot of FWA demand, that's a signal that you could put in a fiber and you get demand. So for lots of the second homes in Finland, they're replacing FWA with fiber. So the long-term trend, I think, is that will happen, but FWA will be part of the mix. Now, as a result of that, what's happened, say, for Elisa, in the first 3 quarters of last year, because of the move from FTTH, from FWA to FTTH, the actual network usage declines. And probably for the whole of 2024, traffic levels will be down. So this will be the first operator probably in Europe to see that. But it's a reflection of the fact that Finland is an early adopter of FWA and has utilized it for its flexibility. And now you've got a migration from FWA to FTTH. So Scandinavia is very much at the forefront in that regard. So there will still be digging, but there's a lot less.
Still digging and still wires.
Yeah, I mean, so in the UK, there was almost no digging for FTTH last year because they ran out of money.
Right. Okay, perfect. I think we'll end there. Thank you all for coming. We have the predictions are online at Deloitte.no, and Paul is here for a few minutes if you have questions you want to ask him offline. But thank you for coming.